Good afternoon. So this is, I guess, my third talk here at PuppetConf in the past couple of years, and I'm always honored to be a part of this kind of gathering where we share stories and share information about successes and especially failures. And that's kind of one of the things I wanted to bring through this talk today, was to talk about some of the successes we've had in helping users in the open source community, as well as customers with the projects that we work on with Elasticsearch and Logstash. And let's start talking about that kind of stuff. But first, I want to apologize kind of in advance that I think it's neat, all of these cool things you can do with presentation tools these days. So I'm going to apologize in advance for any obnoxious animations, sort of. Animations are amazing. Why is there a flame transition? I don't know. But I have to use it. I can't not. So I apologize, but sort of not apologize. So anyway, hello friends. My name is Jord and Sissel. I work on Logstash. I'm the lead on the Logstash project. I've been working on it as an open source project for about 5 years now. It's been about a full year now since I've been working on it commercially. I work for the Elasticsearch company, which also produces a project called Elasticsearch. And on Logstash, we have about 7 also awesome humans working on the team now. And it's really exciting. It's very cool to see a project that I've basically started as kind of a hobby to being not only a way for me to build a livelihood, but also for others. And I also see this excitement through others, where now folks are being employed because of the things they know about Logstash, which to me is really great. So before I talk about success stories and some failure stories, I want to talk about this new Puppet Approved program, which I'm really excited about. And I'm super excited about this because this nice fellow, Richard's been working on Puppet for quite some time, and he's been working on both the Elasticsearch Puppet module as well as the Logstash Puppet module and several other things. Super awesome guy, really easy to talk to. He's our Puppet specialist at Elasticsearch. And you can find him online at these particular handles. But I kind of like abusing computers in a little way. And if you make a small change to his last name, you spell Pienenberg with an E instead of a U, and you put it through Google Translate, Richard means king. If you don't know the history of that name, Richard's kind of brave king or strong king. But his last name, poorly translated, means the king of Pain Mountain, which is pretty awesome. Frankly, I think he should be in a metal band, but I'm really glad that he's working with us and kind of stewarding these Puppet modules for us. And again, I'm sorry about the slide beforehand. I tend to get a little bit wild. But I'm here to talk about the Puppet module stuff, which is really awesome. Myself, I've been using Puppet for about 7 years now. It's a fantastic project, really great community. I'm really excited to see some of this Puppet Approved thing, because it allows you to reward people who have been working very hard on quality Puppet modules, and also it allows the community to find, the approved or the vetted Puppet modules. One of the challenges I remember early on in the Forge was that it was difficult to find. What's the best Apache module? Well, there's 800 Apache modules. Which one do I use? I'll use none of them and write my own, and now we have 801 Apache modules on the Forge. So this I think is a necessary vetting process, and I'm very excited to see where Puppet Labs is going to take it. So the story behind this fellow, but not his kingship or the metal band he should be running, but is that he's very testing focused. And if you're familiar with Puppet testing tools, we'll talk about that very shortly as an aside to this kind of Logstash or ELK stuff. But we have Jenkins. Jenkins is a really great project. Jenkins is always telling us that our code is not good, right? It's telling me, right? We have some red dots on this slide. Tests fail sometimes. But testing is extremely important, because I would much rather be told, at the start of my workday that Jenkins was testing stuff and it broke, rather than having people or myself deploying something in production and at 3 a.m. I get a phone call saying it broke. So what sort of testing stuff do we use? And I say we, of course, I mean, I'm speaking on behalf of Richard here. There's a lot of tools that are out there available for you as a Puppet author in terms of writing a module, or even just developing your own Puppet things. One of which is RSpec Puppet. This allows you to sort of make assertions about the things that Puppet is doing on your behalf. There's Puppet DocLint and Puppet Lint, which will help you write better documentation and write more sort of stylistically consistent Puppet code, which is very nice. And Beaker is a fairly new thing on my radar, which is fairly cool. There was a talk, I believe, yesterday on Beaker by Alice. I can't remember her last name, but I think it's Alice. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. But Beaker is really, really cool. It kind of takes the idea of asserting that Puppet does a thing, but it does it kind of away from your workstation or away from your testing environment on something that may look like production. So you can have Beaker launch a VM for you, run a bunch of Puppet tests, and then shut down the VM, which is really nice that it doesn't try and turn what is probably your personal laptop or your work laptop into something that looks like production, which is probably what you don't want. So in short summary, testing is awesome. There's a lot of really great Puppet testing tools out there, and we are very, very fond of Puppet at Elasticsearch. We're actually using it to deploy a lot of our internal infrastructure. So whenever we need to deploy a large cluster for testing performance, we use our own Puppet modules that we publish to help make sure that we can launch a 100-node cluster and it works, which is sweet. And now story time. Story time is going to be the bulk of this presentation. I think as humans, you know, or at least personally, I gravitate towards stories. Looking at, you know, reference specifications, seeing code samples is great, but I think that, you know, we can tell stories to each other, and that's what I think a lot of the hallway track type of things at these conferences is, where we're sharing information saying, you know, what was the worst thing you had to do in the last month? Well, at 2 a.m. something caught fire, and that's what this is all going to be about. So let's talk about ELK in the wild. And if I haven't defined it yet, ELK is an acronym that means Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. Brief summary of those tools if you aren't familiar with them. Elasticsearch is a distributed search engine. Logstash is an event processing pipeline. And Kibana is a visualization engine. When you put them all together, you can take data from almost any source with Logstash, store it, and allow you to search and do aggregations and analysis on it with Elasticsearch, and visualize it with Kibana. The visualization portion is extremely important because as humans, and you'll see in some of these stories, that, you know, looking at thousands and thousands or millions and millions of lines of logs is really not useful. It's not a great use of your time, and your brain simply can't cope with that kinds of information. But if you turn that information into a shape, then your brain can start recognizing patterns. And we can use the pattern matching and the pattern analysis system that your brain kind of intuitively has and use that to make decisions about what's going on in the business. So the first story is called I Think I Broke It. And it starts out, someone sends me a message, hey, I think Elasticsearch is not happy. Well, how can you tell? Hold on, let me send you a graph. I like working, this is a fictional name, but this particular team I really like working with because they tend to graph everything. They record metrics even if they don't need to. And this is true for a lot of companies these days. They just like take metrics and store them somewhere, and hopefully they'll be useful in helping them figure out what is going wrong. And the picture looks like this, and we're going to zoom in. I think something's wrong with my cluster. This doesn't look right. The car is upside down. It looks like it's been on fire. It doesn't look good, right? This is a non-operating cluster. So, you know, I might ask, you know, show me some sample logs. OK, hold on. And they show me a sample log, and it's literally the kitchen sink. It has everything. There's like 4,000 different fields. They don't even know what some of the fields mean. Half of them are from some user-submitted data that comes over the web. They're all cookie information. There's all kinds of, it's just a massive event. It's like, I don't know, 50K of data, so many items in this particular data structure. And I think the challenge was simply that complex data at high volume is very hard, right? I think log management is an interesting problem because you have lots and lots of data going so fast, and the data is extremely structured. It's difficult to manage. And so in some ways, this story started out as basically they were trying to solve a problem with the ELK stack, and their cluster melted. And we worked together to figure out what was going wrong, help them get things configured correctly, and if we can, identify any constraints, any performance problems. I think it's probably fair to say that we didn't expect initially that someone would throw massive objects with thousands and thousands of fields into Elasticsearch. And now that we know that use case is very popular, that we can start optimizing for these things. And so this helps us get us like a nice feedback loop. And I would say for this particular fictitiously named customer that they aren't fully successful yet. And to me, I think that just recognizes that some of these data challenges are just very difficult. And by working as a team, we can figure these things out. We can take their business use case, we can take their data load, and we can take our knowledge of the software and fix things so that things can get better. And because it's an open source project, any code fixes or any performance improvements we make as a result of helping this particular user will benefit everyone who uses this software. The next story is talking about the ELK use case at Bloomberg. So Bloomberg needed basically to process 1.5 billion events. I think that should be per day, not per second. I proofread these and I didn't see that. But anyway, that is a lot of events per second. So I believe they needed to do 1.5 billion events per day, which in the scale of things that I see is about like a medium-sized deployment. And one of their challenges was that they just have so many thousands of servers, they're not sure what to do. In your typical case, you might have a few hundred or a few thousand servers, and when something breaks, you have to log into individual servers and run grep or run a couple of scripts that you've written to custom parse your logs. And it's not a very good experience, especially at 2 in the morning when your brain is really trying to be asleep and you have no context. And your active thought skills aren't really at full function. And another thing they needed, which is very common for a lot of companies, is they want to integrate with in-house tools, which is, this could be their machines database, this could be their in-house ticketing system. This could be as far as integrating with some other vendor's piece of software. And because a lot of the software that we produce is open source, and Logstash specifically is built to integrate with lots of different tools, it was easy for them, or it should be easy for them, to do these kinds of things, to integrate with your own tools. So my suggestion is to rub some ELK on it. Obviously, you should not physically pick up an actual ELK and rub it on things for 2 reasons. One, they are quite enormous, and because they are quite enormous, they are very strong, and you probably don't want to be kicked. So there you go. But at the end of this, you end up having lots of departments using this simple logging service. And I think this is sort of kind of what the DevOps movement is. I don't want to define your version of DevOps, but my version of DevOps, which is to say that you've done something to eliminate the barriers between silos in your organization. If you have a Linux team, a SAN team, a network team, a VM team, and they tend to not talk to each other, and if they introduce themselves as, I'm John of the VM land, you've kind of tribalized yourselves. But if you can start working and providing services that cross-cut all the teams, you end up having the teams communicating more effectively because they can communicate through these tools, and you have a shared sort of nomenclature in solving these problems. The next story I want to talk about is ELK at Quizlet. Quizlet has another kind of typical problem where they have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of data. Do you see the bug? I didn't. So again, something woke me up, or something alerted me to a problem, and I have to log into a server and do some grep. And oops, I logged into the wrong server. This server is actually down for maintenance. Let's go to the actual server, or the several servers, and run some grep, or run some custom Perl or some custom scripting, and it's not a great experience. Right? Grep is pretty fast on small data sets, but when you're talking about like terabytes of data, it's go to lunch, come back, get an answer. It's not very fast for these kinds of questions. And at the end of the day, you might say, well, I need to write a script to help me answer this question more frequently. If you keep getting alerted for a known problem, and you have a script that tells you, exactly when a problem happens, you're going to write some mess of a regular expression that looks like this, and then the next day happens, and you don't know I don't know what this does. It's a mess. This is more like a piece of art that you should maybe be framing and putting on a wall. This should not be code that you've handwritten and run on a server, right? And the whole point of writing something like this was to get a graph that, again, your brain looks and says there's a shape, knowing what the business should be doing based on what this shape is saying. Okay, there was a spike, and now there's this like kind of small slope. What does that mean? Is that a problem for the business? If I'm actively debugging a problem, does the shape of this particular graph, does that indicate that some kind of information about the problem, or can I stop looking at this particular data set? You might be looking at an application failure, but the real underlying problem is that a backend database disk has failed, and so asking the application how it's feeling doesn't matter. You need to get to the root of the problem, and that's what ELK helps you solve. The next story I want to talk about is ELK at CERN. CERN is the housing of the Large Hadron Collider. They do a lot of really awesome science. You should go to YouTube and type in -YKB2, or just this. 2 years ago, they had a keynote here, which was awesome. If you haven't seen it, it's on YouTube. You should totally watch it, where they talk about partly all of the really awesome science stuff they do at CERN, as well as how they manage their machines and their kind of methodology for managing systems with Puppet. Highly recommend you watch this. But with respect to logging, the CERN operations teams have to deal with like thousands of events per second, which, if you actually watch this talk, is really nothing. From what I remember from this talk, they have their equipment is capable of emitting several petabytes of data per second, but the things that are capable of receiving that data cannot write that fast, so they actually have to throw away a lot of the science. But technology will catch up. So in CERN's idea, like thousands of things per second is really not a whole lot, but you still need some kind of solution to manage it. grep is not going to help you. So an engineer from CERN wrote about this in a blog post called Finding the Needle in the Haystack, which is often a good metaphor for these logging challenges. And this person said, what we really liked about Kibana, which is the visualization system, that the application developers can make their own dashboards, and they can monitor their systems that they're developing on their own without someone from another team needing to help them. So whereas in previous examples where we had that framed regular expression, someone from an engineering or ops team had to write that, and you have to maintain that. You can't just give that regular expression to a non-technical team and say, here you go. It's not user accessible. It's not non-expert accessible. And so the summary was that they believe Kibana to be well done, but the most important point, I think, that came out of this summary was that it's usable by non-experts. This is why we recommend using Logstash to take your kind of junky logs, apply some processing to them, and get something structured out of it so that then you can expose this data and share it among teams. And at Elasticsearch, we kind of call this democratizing your data, where you're taking data that's normally only accessible to experts or only accessible to people with the right level of access, which includes SSH access to the right machines, knowledge of where on those machines those log files are, and finally, how to read those log files. All of these are extreme challenges. And by centralizing this data through Elasticsearch and by providing tooling to view the data through Kibana, you actually allow more teams within your business to get things done and ask questions of this data without having to necessarily interact or ask you to do it on their behalf, where you is the operations or engineering team. The next story I want to talk about is OpenStack. Very excellent project. OpenStack has this kind of sub-project called the Elastic Recheck, where they use Elasticsearch to kind of classify and track OpenStack build failures. And what that looks like in a rough diagram is they have Jenkins, and they point it at Logstash. And through Logstash, it gets into Elasticsearch. And they use this a number of ways, one of which is to track incidences that Jenkins has found of certain bugs. Right? This graph comes from data from build failures that come from Jenkins that are stored in Elasticsearch. And this graph shows you, based on what is tagged in the bug, how frequently this bug is believed to be found. And I don't know if you can read it, but it says there were 0 failures in the last 24 hours, but 188 failures in the last 10 days. Maybe it was fixed. So this is very cool. And you may not be able to see it, but at the very bottom left, there's a little word that says Logstash. If you're interacting with the system, that's a link. And that takes you to a view in Kibana of the logs that are specifically related to this ticket in the build failures, which is quite cool. So instead of having to go onto machines or kind of troll through the plain text logs that Jenkins shows you, you get a nice, very quick saying, OK, I have a bug. Here's how frequently the build failures are detecting it. And here's all the logs. Really fast. The next story is called We're Launching on Friday. So in this story, you have probably an operations person playing with Kibana, trying to figure out how to make it useful for their own team. And a project manager walks by and sees this, does a double take, and is like, whoa, 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 whoa. What is this? You kind of explain it. You know, it's for log management. We get some good insight on what's going on in our systems. I need that right now. No, seriously, like now. We're launching something unrelated to your work on Friday. No pressure. By the way, this is going to be a global thing. Millions of people are going to be using this project. So you try and figure it out. You work with the engineering team, and you decide that Logstash feels kind of slow. And I encourage you, when dealing with software and computers, like your intuition is probably not going to lie to you. If it feels crappy, it probably is. My perspective on this is that if you feel like Logstash is misbehaving, it's either a bug in the software or it's a bug in the documentation. It's not your fault. That's just my supposition. So you maybe approach me and say, Logstash feels kind of slow. Like, what can you do? I'm like, well, show me what you see. This is great. Was it always looking like this? Or no? All right, it's a bug. What happens is, we get both open source users and support customers coming to us with questions, and many times these questions lead to discovery of bugs or performance problems. And that's very important to me. I like that quick feedback, rather than wondering if it's a bug or filing a bug in a ticket system and having it idle for 12 years. It's important to have that kind of human-to-human feedback, an acknowledgement that what you're seeing or what you're perceiving is actually real and validated. And we say, yes, this is a bug. In this particular case, because we understood the pressures that this team was under to deliver this thing that wasn't really well planned, as far as I understood it, deliver this thing by next week, essentially. That was going to be tracking all the logs for this global server system. And we took a small sample of their logs and a small piece of their Logstash config, and we identified that it was really slow. It was just, we agreed. We completely agree it's really dumb. And when we looked at the code, we said that was not very smart. We should not have done that particular piece of code. Made a small change, and performance went up by a factor of 6. We don't intend to write software that's slow, but we might accidentally write software that's not as fast as it should be. All right. That is my final story. I intended this talk to be a little short because I wanted to open it up for questions. But the last thing I would mention was that, kind of a repetition, I like to repeat this in all of my talks, is that for Logstash, if you're running it and it's acting funky, it's probably a bug. And again, if it's acting weird, you probably got that way because you were following documentation that led you down to this path of a non-functioning system. And so it's either a bug in the software that we can fix or a bug in the documentation that we can fix. Any questions? Do we have a mic? I can repeat the questions. So the question was, do we have any documentation for getting started developing on Logstash? I would say we have some, and it is probably quite poor. So we do have a little bit of documentation. Most of the documentation we have is for getting started, how to use it, some of the concepts, and as well as like the massive body of documentation that is the plugins, like how to do it, how to use an input, how to use a filter, how to use a specific output. But I think we have 2 documents that tell you how to write a new plugin. And in the next version that's coming out, hopefully very soon, we've added some new documentation to walk you through more specifically how and why we do things, and how to write an input, how to write a filter, et cetera. The question was, are there any plans to add ACLs to Kibana? My answer to that is probably. So I will answer it two ways. One, there's a fork of Kibana called Kibana auth, I believe, that you might consider investigating that does add these kind of access controls. The other thing I would say is that security isn't something that we take lightly, and that if we are to deliver security in this whole ecosystem, we can't do it incrementally. We have to do it all or nothing, because if we do it incrementally, there's going to be lots of holes. And because security is something that you have to trust, if we give you something that we say, you can trust this, but it's not done yet, right, you're not going to trust it. And so I think if and when we deliver something that is security related, it will be all-encompassing. But yeah, check. I have had several reports of folks walking by the booth today who say they are using this fork, and they are fairly happy with it, even if it isn't like full end-to-end security, encryption, good access control lists, but it may be enough for you. Okay, good question. So I will try and briefly summarize. Is that you're asking, is there any ongoing work or effort to put into like shared configuration or being able to publish your own dashboards? I think in the back of my mind, I've always, let me start over. There used to be a thing called the Logstash Cookbook, and it looked like a wiki, and it acted like a wiki, but I refuse to call it a wiki because in my head, I've seen what happens to wikis, and when I read the word wiki, I translate that as where documentation goes to die. And it's unfortunate, but that often is true because it just, as soon as you write a document about a piece of software and the documentation's out here, the software keeps moving, the documentation is now false, it's now lies. And this is why you end up reading tutorials on a blog and they don't work because they're 2 years old and software changes. And so I think what I had in mind with the cookbook, which is now defunct, we destroyed it because it was hurting people, was that people could publish their own Logstash configs on how they parsed certain kinds of logs, and they could also publish their Kibana dashboards that went along with it. And in many cases, I think that would provide a lot of value, but I think we just didn't execute on it very well. And I think if and when we revisit that, I would like to do it soon, is allowing people to publish Logstash configs and Kibana dashboards together as sort of like a packagey thing, along with tests and sample logs to verify that it's still working, so that when we do a new version of Logstash, we can say, okay, look at all these published configurations. We can verify it still actually works, right? And then it doesn't have that sort of bit rot about it. Like, it could still be stale, and it may have never changed in 2 years, but we have Jenkins telling us that we broke it. So hopefully, I'm hoping we get to that soon. You really, you really want to stop using AW stats? Yeah, I think, I don't know. We'll get there. We'll get there.
If we go to distributing the ELK stack with all of the components together, do you recommend using that stack at scale, or do you recommend, once you get to a certain size, decoupling them and being able to update them independently from one another?
Okay, so the question, there was a statement and then a question. The statement was that we've begun kind of distributing the ELK stack as a single download. And do we recommend deploying that as a production, or do we recommend deploying them independently so you can maintain them independently? Logstash actually, as far back as I can remember, has generally always shipped with at least Elasticsearch inside itself and some kind of web interface. Back in the day, the web interface was really bad. And then Kibana came along and saved the day, which was great. And so we've been shipping with Kibana and Elasticsearch for probably 1.5 years now. Do I recommend you do this in production? At scale. So Kibana itself there's no back end right now. It's just serving static files. So frankly, it doesn't matter what serves that up. So you could use like the Logstash web thing to serve it up. But for Elasticsearch, I actually recommend you deploy them independently. For context for folks, the Elasticsearch output in Logstash, which allows you to take all of your log data and dump it into Elasticsearch, it has this setting called embedded. And if you set embedded to true, it runs an Elasticsearch data node alongside your Logstash agent. And you can totally do this, but I only recommend it for proof of concepts. Just as a kind of way to say, well, here's one command, and I have all 3 of these things up. And now I can dump data into it for a demo or a proof of concept. Certainly, there are concerns for maintenance boundaries, right? You may want to, I would say you may. You are going to want to upgrade Elasticsearch independent of Logstash. They aren't tied to each other anymore. And so if you want to upgrade to Elasticsearch 1.4 when it comes out, but your Elasticsearch clients on Logstash are older, well, then you have to shut down Logstash first and then bring it. It's not something that's easy to maintain. You want to decouple things. Hopefully that answers your question. What are the plans for instrumentation of Logstash itself? I have 2 answers for this. One is a story. So I am slightly embarrassed to say that Logstash to date is basically a black box in terms of monitoring it from production. And that's my bad. It's been like a 4-year-long, 5-year-long my bad. And a couple of years ago, as I was deploying it in production, I was like, no, we really need some metrics. I really need to know what's going on. And we implemented some code. I say we, me. I implemented some really bad code that was just really poor, not smart. And it gave metrics. It was great. I could see how long time was being spent in a certain filter, how long times were being spent waiting to go out of the system. But it also kind of cut performance by half, which was not good. It would take you from 100,000 events a second to 50, which, I couldn't reasonably say, here's some metrics, and by the way, go ahead and buy twice as much hardware. Like the value of metrics provide would not be twice the hardware cost. And so I quickly aborted that change and tucked it away in the deepest recesses of Git so that no one will ever see it again. Hopefully it's been garbage collected by now and it's gone. But our intention as a team and as a company is to start adding new metrics very soon. I think Elasticsearch itself, if you've ever used it in production or if you never have, Elasticsearch is driven almost entirely by HTTP API calls. And it has a lot of statistics APIs for it. You can ask stats about how big an index is, how long certain operations have taken on that index, how a node is doing, how long GC operations have been, garbage collection operations have been taking on that node. All of these things are useful for the operations of your cluster, none of which is available in Logstash, which is weird because I'm an operations person by background and I worked on a piece of software for 5 years and it's a black box. I don't really know how that happened, but the more I look back at it, I'm like, that was not good. But it is coming soon. I just want to make sure that when we do implement it, like security, we want to do it well and something that doesn't totally destroy performance. I think, in general, shaving off 5% performance to allow you to be able to inspect it at 3 a.m., that would be cool with me. But 50%, Somebody raised their hand. We have 5 minutes left. Or all the minutes. I mean, really, it's up to y'all. What's that? No beer. Beer, food, party. It's a good strategy. If there's nothing else, yes? Any more releases of Logstash Forwarder? This is another thing where I just feel bad about the code. And part of it was, I hadn't been managing my time very well. But recently, in the last couple of months, we've been attending to the project. We have sort of this fissure where I know the forwarder is in a fairly good state, but it has some bugs, and people have been fixing them, including myself. But also, there are certain things about the design that I want to fix, and that might require some serious refactoring, which means you'll end up with two code bases, one that people are using and one that you hope people use in the future. And balancing that transition is something that takes a lot of thought and planning, and I'm not sure exactly how to do it. But I will say it's maintained now, and the advice I will give you is build from master. Master has tests that are passing and people using it. We should do a release, and maybe we'll do that in the next week or two. But for now, build from master. I think the last release we did, unfortunately, was quite some time ago, and we should not have let it go that long. It was almost a year? Oh, good Lord. Who runs this project? Is there a plan to do includes? Did you know that Logstash allows you, for the config file flag, you can actually give it a directory? He said, oh, awesome. So you can do three things. The -f or -- config flag, you can give it a file, you can give it a wildcard, or you can give it a directory. And if you give it a wildcard or a directory, it finds all the files that would match that. If it's a directory, it's all the files in the directory. And it sorts them by name. So if you really need them ordered, you can totally do that. But inputs and outputs aren't necessarily ordered. So hopefully that solves that. Our Puppet module is also very excellent. Sorry, do I have a recommendation for message queue? I have two answers. I always have two answers. Yes and no. No, that's a good answer. I like that, Vincent. So my first answer is if you already have a message, the question was, what message queuing technology or system do we recommend? My first recommendation is always to ask a question, do you already have something deployed? If you already have Redis or RabbitMQ or ActiveMQ or a Stomp server or something else deployed, totally keep using that. Logstash will work with it. If you're using a messaging technology that we don't already support, adding a plugin that will support it is usually quite easy. One of, I think, the successes, I admitted to many mistakes in the Logstash project, but I think one of the things that we definitely succeeded with was making it easy for non-programmers, or folks who claim to be non-programmers, that they can add new plugins. For a number of years, I would get rather apologetic pull requests and patches from people to say, I wrote this thing, it seems to work for me, I'm sorry, I'm not actually a real programmer. Whatever that really means, I have no idea. But I don't know how you can not be a programmer and produce code. You're a programmer. When I say it should be easy, that's based on an observation, not my hope. And if you find it not easy, it's a bug. Very recently, we added support from the community for Kafka, which is another messaging transport technology. Very excited about that. We have input and output support for that. So that was my first answer. If you're using something already, keep using it. My second answer, if you have nothing, if you know nothing about the landscape, my recommendation is Redis. And now you might look at Redis and go, that's not actually a message queue, but it has operations on it that allow you to push and pop. So you have a queue. And so the reason we recommend Redis, if you have no other inclination, is because it's operationally very simple. You just kind of stand it up, and then you forget about it. And Logstash does its thing. So hopefully I answered that question for you. And it may be soon that we start recommending Kafka, but as soon as you start getting into the more obviously message-oriented technologies like RabbitMQ or Kafka, the operational constraints, the operational complexity gets much more difficult. Whereas with RabbitMQ, you have to learn about the underlying technology and the protocols and install Erlang and understand the system. Whereas Redis, you can just treat as a black box, and Logstash just does the thing on it. One more question. So the question was, is support for Kafka based on Elasticsearch rivers, or is it something else? There are actually, I have two more answers. Yes. Yes. First answer. The answer is no. It's not based on rivers. It's Logstash. So Logstash has an input and an output. I think the reason, and this will dovetail into my next answer, the reason we are going to start more heavily emphasizing using Logstash instead of rivers is for two reasons. One, with rivers, you can't really modify the message before it goes into Elasticsearch. Logstash has this wonderful filtering ecosystem, filtering plugins that allows you to modify something after it comes in and then do something with it, like dump it into Elasticsearch. And it also scales a little bit better than Elasticsearch rivers do. Elasticsearch rivers only run on one of the nodes, and because it wasn't built in a way that's distributed, and Logstash already does much more easily, that was hard to say, than the river system, we're going to be deprecating the river system very soon. And as part of that deprecation, we're going to be including documentation for existing river authors, how to take your current river for Elasticsearch and convert it to a Logstash input. And we're going to be taking, if there's an official Elasticsearch river that you're using today, we're going to be converting that to an input as well. So that'll be useful, as well as providing a sort of like a parity between, if you have a river that you're maintaining today, that you can look at what was previous in Elasticsearch and what is current in Logstash, and sort of use that as a template for learning. All right, thank you very much.